The third series of Westworld was released to mixed reviews, with some viewers claiming that the show had lost its touch, and much of what made the first two series great was seemingly absent from this new instalment. And they're not entirely wrong. Some of the elements which made earlier episodes so compelling are diminished or missing entirely from Series 3. Central to understanding how the show missed the mark in its most recent instalment is the notion of character setup, in particular with regards to the show's protagonist Dolores, but also with some of the other characters like the new antagonist Seger. Let's begin with some character theory. K.M. Weiland suggests that most characters in fiction have a want and a need, and these two are often in conflict with each other. This is to say that at the start of the story, characters will have a set goal which is their want. This is usually an external desire, something the character strives for, which they believe to be the solution to their internal, underlying problems. They will spend most of the story in the pursuit of that want, but they eventually come to realise their true need, which is the actual solution to their internal problems. In some cases the need consolidates the want, but usually it's an opposing idea which requires the character to reconsider their original goals. At this turning point, they will abandon their want and fully pursue their internal need. Most character arcs will follow this template to some extent, and Dolores is no exception. Throughout Series 1, her want is interestingly the absence of want. She fully believes she is the character she was designed to play in Westworld. Over the course of the series, however, she comes to understand her true need, which is to attain sentience. This is brilliantly set up at the end of the first episode, as we see her initially breaking her loop, and in that action of swatting the fly, we understand that she is unlike the other hosts and is on the path to discovering her consciousness. This need is then fulfilled by the end of the series, when she fully seizes control of her own destiny by killing her creator and former master Ford. With this initial goal realised, her want and need become aligned in the second series. She wants to escape the park to secure freedom for her kind, and needs to, or else she'll be recaptured by her former masters at Delos. By the end of the series, she's successful, and escapes the park into the real world. Therefore, the natural continuation of her want into Series 3 is arguably to consolidate her freedom and establish a haven for the hosts to live without fear of renewed persecution from Delos and by extension humanity. This is certainly what the viewer is led to believe throughout the end of Series 2 and the beginning of Series 3. As we know, this was not the case. The finale of Series 3 revealed that her goal was not to destroy humanity, but rather save it. This twist is not in and of itself a bad writing decision. In fact, it could be argued that while her want was to destroy humanity and establish a safe colony for the hosts, her underlying need was to realise that most humans were like her, trapped in loops dictated to them by unseen masters, and therefore also needed saving. Part of the issue is that this was not set up at all in the earlier series. To introduce some more character theory, Seger suggested that while compelling characters surprise us, startle us, change all our preconceived ideas about them, they also need to be consistent, and that if a character deviates too far from their core personality, they may come across as incredible, as not making sense or adding up. And this is entirely the issue with Dolores. It's not that she changed her mind about humanity, it's that this decision went against her entire established character. The flashback that occurs during this revelation suggests that she had already arrived at this conclusion long before the events of Series 3, when she first met Caleb and discovered that there could be good in humanity. Yet this contradicts her actions and motivations throughout the first two series, in which she is entirely willing to murder innocent parkgoers to attain her freedom. There are limitations to this line of thinking, in that the parkgoers were typically depicted as the elite which controlled regular people like Caleb, and so the hosts were therefore less remorseful about their deaths. However, it still seems incredible that Dolores, who was seen as wholly ruthless in her quest for freedom, even going so far as to manipulate her own kind to perform these acts of violence, would change her mind this drastically. Ironically, the idea of a host working to save humanity was actually established in the first two series. Maeve, who had previously shown great empathy with certain human characters in the park, would have been far more suited to the role of human saviour than Dolores. She is held hostage by Seger, the main antagonist of Series 3, and so is perfectly positioned to secretly undermine him and help the humans if she can. However, she seemingly mindlessly obeys Seger at every turn, until she discovers Dolores' true intentions, at which point she conveniently remembers her motivations from earlier series. This speaks to a greater issue surrounding Series 3, which is the idea of setting up twists. Arguably, this series had mastered the art of the twist. Reveals in the first series were genuinely shocking at times, but upon rewatching the show, the hints are all clearly placed from the beginning. The twists also do not work towards the detriment of character setup, but rather further it. For instance, the reveal that Bernard was a host became an integral part of his character as he reforged his identity over the course of the second series. The twists in Series 3, however, felt cheap, unearned, and this is because they were not properly set up by the writers. It came to feel as though the show was constantly trying to one-up itself, rather than further the narrative in any meaningful way. To take an obvious example, the reveal that Stubbs, Westworld's chief of security, was also a host, did not have the same impact that the same reveal had with Bernard. This is because unlike Bernard, for whom being a host became a key part of his internal conflict, Stubbs is already aware of his status as a host, something which again did not feel adequately set up in the previous series. Rather than take this revelation in an interesting direction, such as have him wrestle with his past at the park destroying other hosts, his character is relegated to simply obeying Bernard's commands and being someone who Bernard can present exposition to. As a result, the twist doesn't seem to add anything of value to the narrative, and the dynamic between Bernard and Stubbs could have arguably been more interesting if Stubbs was in fact human. This relationship would have served as a prototype for the human-host bonds which Dolores later comes to acknowledge, and vitally would have provided Bernard with an opposing viewpoint. Instead, we're left with a monotonous duo absent of any real personality or interesting conflict. Going back to the idea of setups, let's now turn our attention to the actual situation presented in Series 3. The previous series revealed Delos' true purpose for Westworld, which was not simply to provide an immersive role-playing holiday experience for the elite, but more sinisterly, to gather data on the guests in an attempt to replicate true humanity. James Delos was posthumously recreated as a host, although the system was imperfect as the host's mind degraded over time. This experiment was planned to continue, with the after-credits scene revealing that William too had been posthumously recreated as a host long into the future. It's reasonable to assume, therefore, that this plot would have continued into the third series. Unfortunately, it was dropped in favour of an entirely new storyline involving Serac and his program, Rehoboam, which calculated precise outcomes for every person on Earth and corrected any deviations from his design. This new antagonistic force was unfortunately not set up anywhere in the first two series, which is why it felt as though it came from nowhere. With the third series' reduced length of 8 episodes, there was also not adequate time to establish Rehoboam within the story world effectively. Serac too, as the main villain of the third series, was introduced at the end of episode 2, and therefore had just 5 episodes to be fleshed out ahead of the finale. This line of thinking is limited though, as Caleb, another new character introduced in Series 3, felt very three-dimensional and had a clear arc over the course of the series. If we apply the theory of want and need to him, we find that his drives are nearly identical to those Dolores held in the first series, which is to say he has an absence of want and needs to discover the system controlling him so that he too can break his own loop. Over the 8-episode run, he's afforded an interesting backstory which makes you question his motivations, but he ultimately strives to do the right thing and is presented as a likeable character. Arguably, he was one of the strengths of the third series, and his final positioning as leader of the human uprising, much like Dolores before him, means that the continuation of his story could prove interesting. Despite the interest we have in Caleb, he unfortunately had very little agency throughout the third series. Much of his character came from his backstory, with his actions in this narrative amounting mostly to assisting Dolores without question. If we're to assume that Caleb has taken over the mantle as the show's key protagonist, which the show certainly wants us to, given his function as an audience surrogate who is launched into this extraordinary world of hosts vying for power, then we expect him to contribute more to the narrative unfolding than to simply observe as Dolores carries out her plan. Of this, it's noteworthy that in fact very few characters in this series possessed agency. As discussed, Bernard and Stubbs had little to do beyond chase Dolores and speculate as to her motives. Maeve had little to do beyond do Serac's bidding, and William, who was reintroduced in conflict with the Series 2 ending, had the promise of agency, only to be killed off for a second time in an after-credits scene. In this regard, arguably Dolores and Serac were the only two characters who advanced the narrative of the third series. This sort of reduction is perfectly acceptable in short-form storytelling like films or even some television series if its emphasis is on character study. But Westworld was set up as a massive ensemble series in the first 2 seasons, and managed to successfully juggle various plot threads without ever becoming burdened by them. Ironically, by widening the scope of the setting to the real world, the show felt smaller than ever. The 3rd series was not totally devoid of merit. As discussed, Caleb felt to be a genuinely interesting character with meaningful layers, and it will be interesting to see what he does next without Dolores dictating his actions to him. In particular, the look and feel of the real world setting was also incredibly refreshing. The vast, airy spaces of the future were perfectly suited to the show's tone and were much more optimistic than the dystopian worlds we've come to expect from science fiction in recent years. Unfortunately, however, the 3rd series fell short of the expectations set up by the first 2. If situations and revelations had been properly set up, and characters were imbued with more agency, it certainly could have reached the same heights as the first episodes, but ultimately felt like a misstep in the narrative. I hope you've enjoyed this analysis, and it may have shed some light on what was, for many, a disappointing series. I would love to hear what you thought of the show in the comments, and if you've liked this video, subscribe for more. Thanks.